I have another free Tiana's Closet pattern for you. Today we're sewing the Salma Raglan top. This top features gathers along the raglan sleeve for the front and back bodice, a button opening at the back neckline, and elastic along the bottom of the sleeves. The woven fabric that I'm using in today's video is a semi-sheer rayon blend. This pattern is beginner-friendly, suitable for all sewing levels. I hope you join me. Let's get started. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece, and I've transferred my dart markings from the pattern piece. Now I'm going to fold each of my darts in half and pin in place from one side of the dart to the other. Now we can sew the darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at each point to tie it in knots. And then press your darts downward. Here is one of my sleeve pieces, and we're going to sew gathering stitches from the notches to the neckline on both the front and back sides. Use the longest stitch on your machine and leave thread tails at both ends so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Now I'll place my sleeve right sides together with the front bodice, and for this pattern the double notches indicate the front. Match your notches and pin in place. I'll also pin in place at the bottom and at the neckline. Now I'll pin in place from the notch to the underarm. Now I can pull my gathering stitches so that the rest of the sleeve fits the arm side. Once it fits and the gathers are distributed evenly, pin in place. And I'll repeat to attach my opposite sleeve to the opposite arm side. Then I'll sew these seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. Here is the right side of my front bodice and my sleeves, with the sleeves opened out away from the bodice. And now I'm going to start attaching the back piece to the back side of the sleeves, placing each of the back bodice pieces right sides together with their arm size, and matching the notches, which again for this pattern, the single notch indicates the back. Pin in place and gather as we did for the front pieces. Now I'll sew and finish the seam allowance for both of these back sleeve seams. Before I sew the side seams and the underarm seams, I'm going to finish the bottom edges of both of my sleeves. And then I'll take it to my ironing board and press up those finished edges to the wrong side by the hem allowance of 1 inch. Now that those sleeve hems are pre-pressed and we have a memory crease, I'll open out that hem for now and place my front and back bodice and their sleeves right sides together. Now we can pin the side and underarm edges matching that underarm seam. And repeat on both sides. Now I'll sew both of these seams from the bottom of the sleeve across the underarm and to the bottom of the bodice with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then finish the raw edges. Now to form the elastic casing at the bottom of the sleeve, you're going to fold the sleeve hem along your pre-press line and stitch along those finishing stitches, leaving about 1 inch gap to insert your elastic. I've cut a piece of 1/2 inch wide elastic to fit comfortably around my bicep. Now I'll attach a safety pin to one short edge and draw it through the bottom of the sleeve through the gap that I left in my stitches. Now I can overlap those two short ends of the elastic and zigzag back and forth to secure. Then we can pull the elastic entirely inside the casing and sew closed the opening in your stitches. Here are both of my back bodice pieces, and I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges for the center backs from top to bottom. Now I'm going to place these back bodice pieces right sides together and pin together from the notch to the bottom of the bodice. Now I'm going to sew from the notch back stitching to secure all the way to the bottom of the bodice with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to press the entire seam open, even the unsewn portion. Now that my center back seam is pressed open, including the seam allowance on either side of the slit, we're going to top stitch around the slit along those finishing stitches from the neckline to the bottom of the slit, pivoting across, and then back up the other side of the slit. One option for preparing your button loop is to cut a small piece of scrap fabric. I've cut a 1-inch wide strip, cutting it a little bit longer than what I'm going to be needing. It's about 4 inches long. I'm going to press this wrong sides together in half, and then I'll press those outer raw edges to meet the crease, also wrong sides together. And then we'll fold and press it in half once more along the original crease line. So we end up with this small strip with all the edges concealed. And we're going to stitch along the open edges to close it up. Now for the neckline binding piece, I've gone ahead and pressed one of the long raw edges to the wrong side by about 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to take the unfolded raw edge of the bias tape and place it right sides together, starting at the center front. So I've marked the center front of both my bias tape and the neckline. Starting at the center front will allow us to determine how much we need to ease in the bias tape to get an even fit around the neckline. Keeping in mind that we also want the short edge of the bias tape to extend beyond the center back by about 3/8 of an inch. Pin the neckline binding in place all the way around. Now that that's pinned, I'll sew the binding in place from center back to center back with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that the binding is attached, we're going to take that folded edge of the binding and turn it to the inside of the garment so that now the binding is turned to the inside along the seam that we just created, and we have a nice clean finish to the binding on the inside. Pin in place like this all the way around. Now along the center back edges, you should have some bias tape extending beyond the center back, which we're going to tuck in between the bias tape and the main bodice and pin in place. Do the same thing on both sides. And for the side of the center back that you'd wish to place your button tab at, you can go ahead and determine how big of a buttonhole you need and cut your tab to fit, allowing some seam allowance. Now I'm going to place the two short ends together and tuck this button tab piece in between the bias tape and the main garment. Now we can sew around the entire neckline to secure the bias binding, sewing with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance, just making sure that you're catching the bias binding on the inside as you sew. We're also going to be sewing vertically at each center back to close the bias tape and to secure the button loop. Then we can sew the button across from the button loop. Now for the very bottom of the garment, I've prepared the hem just as I did for the bottom of the sleeve. I finished the raw edges all the way along the bottom of the garment and pressed that hem to the wrong side by 1 inch all the way around. Now I'm going to edge stitch close to my finishing stitches all the way around. And now our blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. So here's the finished garment. I didn't have to make any changes. I just sewed to my measurements. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.